This week on the agenda, promoting the private sector, how China's new national law will cut red tape and stoke economic growth. The private sector is an important part of China's economy, helping it grow sustainably and compete globally. More than 90% of all market entities in China are private enterprises, making up 56.8% of foreign trade and 60% of China's GDP. The private sector is the backbone of China's innovation ecosystem, contributing to more than 70% of the nation's technological breakthroughs and advancements. And they drive employment, making up 80% of the urban workforce and 90% of new jobs. But while the government supports all that, the private sector faces challenges that state-owned initiatives often don't, including financing constraints, regulatory hurdles, and a shortage of talent. Now, China has introduced a new law to protect and promote the private sector in line with the treatment of state-owned firms. The goal is to foster a stable and predictable business environment for all that encourages investment and growth. Joining me now are Jing Liu, Professor of Accounting and Finance and Director of the Investment Research Centre at the Cheung Graduate School of Business. Lundblad is the Richard Levin Distinguished Professor of Finance at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Michele Geraci is a former Undersecretary of State at Italy's Ministry of Economic Development. Great to have you all on the agenda. Jing Liu, let me start with you, because this is the first law specifically focused on promoting the private sector, private economy. How consequential is it?
It's very, very important. And this is one of the first, it's first in kind. And the reason for this law is really because, the Chinese private business has been retreating a little bit in the economy in the last 15 years or so. If you look at the Chinese growth in the last 40 years, I would say that the most important driver is the market and also the private business. But roughly in the last 15 years, you see a sort of a gradual decrease in the importance of the private business in the Chinese economy. And we know that, for the private business, it's very, very important for innovation. It's very important in terms of driving growth. And also it's very important in terms of generating employment. And currently, the Chinese economy is under pressure. So that's the reason that, to revitalize the private sector is one of the most important things in order to revitalize the whole economy.
Michele, what do you think? How key are private enterprises to China's economic growth?
Well, we are at the time in the world where all countries, including Italy, Europe, the US, China, we are kind of thinking where to put the line between the state and the market. And some countries have a larger proportion of the economy coming from state-owned enterprises, like China, for example, despite these changes. France, a little bit so. England, very little, mostly private. And I tell you, even in the political circles here in Europe, we're just debating this thing. Is the market really the most efficient way to run an economy? Or there are certain areas where the state need to take a stronger role, maybe because some industries are natural monopolies, maybe because some sectors are strategic assets for their country, energy, steel, manufacturing, raw materials, and things like that. And therefore, I think we are in a very interesting time where we are a little bit going back and forth to see where these lines should be. Because, of course, when the market takes a larger proportion of the economy, then the state needs to retreat. And when the state retreats, it's less easy to stimulate certain sectors because that's left to individual market decision. It is difficult to subsidize which is also important for infant and innovation industry. So I think it's a very big, interesting academic and practical question at the same time.
It's interesting, isn't it, looking at the ecosystem, if you want it, in a slightly different way. Christian, let's get the timing of this straight, because this law has been in the works for a year, possibly more, but it's been passed in the middle of this tariff storm. Do you think that makes a difference?
Yes, I think it does. I mean, the reality is, while this has been in the works for some time, as you alluded, this is a particularly complicated environment, both externally as well as internally within China. So I think this reflects the leadership's commitment to strengthening these kind of fundamental foundations of the domestic economy in a world that's, increasingly complex. And so, what does it do? It kind of codifies the support for private enterprise. And that's in the backdrop of not only these external pressures that I think are front and center and particularly consequential for all of us around the world, not just China, but also in an environment where there is a renewed need for some degree of dynamism in the domestic economy. But at the end of the day, I also do want to emphasize some things we heard already, which is there is an important role for the private sector internally, and some of that challenge there is also part of the conversation too.
Jing Liu, look, we know, I want to stick to these external factors just for a moment, because we know now there's this 90-day pause, this 90-day tariff truce, if you like. But supply chain dynamics, you could argue, have been completely upended, with implications for firms of all shapes and sizes. So I wonder what detail around the private sector would make a difference in all of the trade negotiations.
Actually, if you look at the Chinese exports to the U.S., right? So I would say that probably most of the exports are done by the private sector. So therefore, when the U.S. Put on tariffs on the Chinese goods, it's basically putting on the tariffs on these private companies. Since this is actually the second round of the tariff war, right? In the first round, actually, many of the Chinese private business have already responded to the pressure from overseas. Many of them moved some operations to other countries, for example, to Mexico, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, and other countries in Southeast Asia. So this time you can see that the tariff actually not only targets China, but also targets other countries where there are lots of Chinese operations. So I would say that this time, when the tariff was added again to Chinese exports, it had a very heavy effect on the Chinese business. Because I personally teach many of these entrepreneurs, and when the tariff war started, they told me that many of the companies actually stopped producing. And because at 145%, there's absolutely no way to do business. So this is going to have a big effect, right, on the exchanges between the US and China. On the Chinese side, basically, you lose all the opportunities, right? You lose all the jobs, you lose all the orders. But on the other hand, I think on the US side, actually, this is also equally bad, right? Because when some of the Chinese goods actually arrived in the US, the price is going to increase by more than 100%. And because many of the Chinese businesses stopped producing, so for many products, you may not actually be able to find the vendors, right? So you're going to see empty shelves in US stores. So I would say that the Chinese business actually play a huge role in a tariff war.
Michele, what are businesses telling you about how this new law focused on private enterprises might change the way they operate against this volatile landscape?
It does help, of course, the private companies, CEOs, because let's bear in mind one thing. We always talk China and the US trade with each other. China has a deficit with the US. China buys goods from US buys from China. This is not true. It is not countries that trade with each other. It is companies, except, of course, for state-owned company when they trade with each other. But that's not the case between China and the US. So this commerce between any two countries is actually executed by individual companies, not by the country itself. And so, of course, this law that could be aimed at growing the domestic private market could also help those companies to find alternative to the possibility of not having as easy access to the US market than they used to have before. And that means also maybe try to stimulate domestic demand for the goods produced by those private companies. Because we didn't talk about this. We are talking here about the supply input, and the focus of this reform of this law is on the production made by private companies. But also we need to focus on the demand side. You know, to which customers do these private companies sell their own products? So we need to stimulate the domestic demand within the Chinese market for the products made by these private companies, and also try to fix the production. Where should it be? I think Christian or the other guest mentioned that production shifted to Mexico and to Vietnam. Vietnam now is the third largest country in the world with the highest surplus versus the United States, 123 billion US dollars. So it is not easy also to shift production out of China into other markets to avoid trade war, because Trump will, or is trying to basically hit anyone that is made by China, not made in China. So a Chinese company operating in Malaysia or in Mexico could be just as hurt as a company that is made in China, because the concept is not moving from made in to made by. So we are chasing and tracing the ultimate shareholder, because I don't agree, of course, but if the US wants to somehow contain the development of China in technology, in strategic industry, then they should look at everything that Chinese companies do, no matter in which country.
Let's zone back in on China and how this new law is going to provide challenges, but obviously big opportunities. I want to pick up on something that you said, Michele, about domestic demand there, which ties in with something, Christian, you mentioned earlier too, because there has been this big issue of confidence, hasn't there, in terms of consumer confidence, but also business confidence. And I wonder if you could sort of outline, what's been going on and how this law might have a step towards alleviating some of that pressure.
Yeah, I want to be super clear. In no way do I want to diminish in any way the external pressures and the challenging geopolitical environment we face with regards to trade.
Sure.
But it is, to your question, quite important to emphasize that there is, a question of confidence among both consumers and private entrepreneurs inside China, right? And some of that has manifested in pressures, certainly due not only to these external considerations, but also some, sector-specific issues, what's happening in real estate. I mean, as you've noted, a very sizable fraction of labor, certainly in the urban setting, is associated with the private sector. And so I think that sector is expressing and hopefully now receiving some greater degree of clarity, around legal protections and sort of long-term, policy direction. And so if we can get clearer guidelines on, what is sort of regulatory treatment, access to financing, formalized protections in terms of, where the private sector sits broadly in the ecosystem of the Chinese economy, all of this can help engender a degree of confidence, right? And that can be part of the effort to create trust and optimism. And as I said kind of earlier, very specifically using Keynes's language of animal spirits, that's how we can drive the economy forward. So there is domestic work to do here, despite the challenges we see from the outside.
Well, speaking of driving the economy forward, I mean, where does this all fit into China's high quality growth, Jing Liu?
Actually, this is very important because you see the Chinese economy is under a period of transition, right? This transition is basically you want to move from a low technology, intense labor kind of production into high technology kind of production, right? So you move up the value chain essentially. And this process is very painful, right? Because on one hand, you want to foster the high-tech industry like AI, robotics, and pharmaceuticals, for example, and everything. That's called, sort of high-quality growth. But on the other hand, you want to basically get rid of some of the redundant or outdated industries. So this process is very painful for those kind of outdated industries, but at the same time provides a lots of opportunities for the sort of high-quality growth area. And in terms of which kind of company actually contributes to the high-quality growth area, roughly speaking, I would say roughly 60 to 70% of the companies are actually private. Because if you look at the innovation in China, most of the sort of really cutting-edge innovation are happening in private business, right? If you look at AI, for example, virtually all the AI firms are private companies. If you look at internet, virtually all the internet are private companies. And in many other fields, actually, the innovators are the private companies. So that's why it's really important to humanize the private companies, right? Because as a whole, they really contribute a lot to innovation, and in addition to, for example, employment.
Well, that's at home. Michele, what about the rest of the world? What signal do you think that this gives to the rest of the world about China as a place to do business?
It sends, I think, two types of signals. So one is, and this is what I've witnessed also in China since for beginning of April, is that China, of course, looks at these tensions with worry, but pretty much it doesn't care very much, and it can show that it can do without engaging too much in international market. Let's remember that export to GDP ratio in China used to be very high, 32% in 2010 during the global financial crisis. And since then, this export to GDP ratio for China has been reduced to roughly 18%, almost half. So in a way, China has done its own decoupling and is less reliant on external demand than it was 15 years ago. Of course, 18% is still a reasonable number, but it's not that China now depends on export. It wants to engage with the rest of the world, and that's what President Xi Jinping there's the dual circulation strategy, where yes, you don't have autocracy like in trade terms, in terms of not trading with other countries, but you do want to reduce both import and export and create an economy where demand and supply are pretty much domestic. So this is the first signal. Then the second signal is also the government is there to help and step in when there are problems. And that, of course, is a big important sign of confidence. We had 5 years of COVID, wars, and economic, maybe not downturn, because 5% is, we wish in Europe we grew by 5%. But exactly when there are problems, this is when the state jumps in and tries to address it. And this is the great comparative advantage that China, pretty much only China has compared to the rest of other countries in the world.
Christian, let's talk about how this is going to work with what we've got so far. We know the law covers fair competition, regulation, investment and innovation, among other things. How will it create a fairer and more transparent business environment?
Yeah, I think to your question of what potentially changes or is emphasized, I think is maybe one way to put it. So, we have this law, we have, the very consequential meeting between the president and some key business leaders not that long ago. I think all of this is designed to signal a very clear commitment to the private sector. And so what fundamentally can change? We can see moves towards equal participation in government procurement, perhaps, licensing processes. We can think about administrative transparency in the regulatory environment, as you alluded to, consistent regulatory enforcement. I think one place that I'm particularly keen to see move forward is the role for financial institutions. So tailoring services that really effectively target private firms to make sure that they have access to capital so that they can grow in compelling ways. So access to credit or investment support. And so I think overall, what can this law do? It can provide formal and perhaps a consistent with the public sector uniform framework to help create some degree of transparency and consistency that can drive a more efficient market environment. That's my hope in terms of when the rubber actually meets the road.
Jing Liu, what do you think? Because a couple of those things that Christian mentioned, financing and market access, that they are barriers that are still to be considered. How soon will that come? How soon does it need to come?
So the Chinese system is quite unique, right, in the world, in the sense that it's essentially top down, right? In China, that all the big decisions are made at the top. So once that decision is made, then the decision is transmitted downwards into local governments and stuff, and to state-owned enterprises, to financial institutions. So I would say that the implementation of this law will be very fast. However, in this process, we need to understand that there would be still some institutional barriers to how this law would become a reality. For example, right, in China, that the private enterprises are kind of difficult to find financing. If you go to the bank, it's easier to get a loan if you are a state-owned enterprise. It's more difficult if you are a private business. And for that, actually, even without any government decree, right? So because the banks themselves are state-owned, right? So in this case, that when the lender lend money to borrowers, they worry about bad loans. In the Chinese case, is that if you lend to a state-owned enterprise and the loan goes bad, then you say, hey, that's a little mistake, so I'll make sure next time I don't make the same mistake. But if you lend the money to a private business and then the loan goes bad, then people start to get concerned and worry that maybe there's a corruption get involved in the process, right? Because now you are basically lending, a state company lend money to a private business. So that's sort of the institutional kind of barrier built into the system. So that's kind of the problem we're going to face. Although the whole country wants to move the private sector to a higher growth level, but I think the institutional barriers will be quite significant.
So there's a cultural and an educational piece there, which I think is quite interesting. And Michele, I wonder what you think there, because if we're talking about this law being implemented quite quickly, how is it going to benefit those small and medium-sized firms, those so-called engines of economic growth, in the short to medium term?
Well, maybe we need to look also at the liberalization of the financial market, because one of the issues that relates to the problem that SMEs do not get access to credit is because the concept of risk in the Chinese debt market, loan market, is not well developed. In fact, even lending and borrowing rates are sometimes decided at policy levels. And so maybe that's why we had in the past small companies going into the shadow market, where they would be happy to pay higher interest rate, even 10, 15%, which is a fairly reflection of the risk of a startup. I put my hat as a finance professor. We need to get rid of the idea that small, medium enterprises can borrow at close to risk-free rates. That's not how the world works. Private equity want a minimum return of 25% because that's what they perceive the risk to be. So we need to not look with dismay at interest rates charged for lending to startup to be very high. They should be high, because also this cleans up the economy. from companies that should not be in the market in the first place. And it's a
Right.
kind of a convenient
Yeah.
way to lend to those who deserve it at the proper cost of money.
It's interesting you talk about cleaning up the economy, and Jing Liu, I wonder what you think here, because we're talking about the impact that all of this is going to have on private enterprises of different shapes and sizes. What about the impact on the broader Chinese economy? When will the benefits start to be felt?
I think this year, actually, the biggest headwind was the tariff war, right?
Yeah.
With the resolution, at least for the next 90 days of the tariff war, I think that's a very good news for the economy. But if you look at the whole economy, right, the Chinese government's target is 5% economic growth. For that 5% to happen, really everything needs to work properly. And one of the things is to basically to revitalize the private business. But the other things are essentially you need to make sure that consumption can actually pick up, right? Because in order to stimulate the economy, you can either stimulate the investment or consumption. But if you stimulate the investment, you're going to have more capacity. If you have more capacity, where do you find the customers? So you really need Chinese customers. So consumption is one key, right? And the other one is essentially the government needs to have more stimulus because the economy is under quite a bit of pressure. And in the last few years, actually, the Chinese government has been quite modest in terms of stimulating the economy, including during the COVID period. And so I would say that in order to achieve the 5%, the government needs to put in more robust stimulus, both in terms of physical and monetary policies.
And Christian, let me ask you this. Do you think this new law makes China more attractive, a more attractive destination for foreign investors looking to partner up with private firms?
Yeah, so I think the potential answer to that is yes. I want to be clear in the sense that I don't think the foreign investors in the foreign business community are the primary audience here. I think that is largely a domestic private sector audience to try to make that environment easier and more predictable, and hence engender both investment and then ultimately some economic activity. But to the extent that a more straightforward environment is present, that does have the potential to attract foreign players, and that can be at the benefit of both the external world and China as well. And so I think this is, generally speaking, a step forward to a more stable and consistent environment. And so at its best, that does have the potential to benefit both domestic and international audiences.
Christian Lundblad, Michele Geraci and Jing Liu, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming soon on The Agenda, rebalancing globalization, how Trump's tariffs are pushing the global south to stand stronger together. But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.